Hello everyone and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? Today we're going to envision the future of open source seed. Open source is normally associated with technology and gadgets, but in this session we will hear more from Claire Luby, Jack Kloppenberg and Andrew Still, who are involved in the Open Source Seed Initiative. And we'll hear more about the vital importance it can have, open source can have, for our food supply. Don't forget, this is an interactive session, so put all your questions, your comments in the comment box below this video, or tweet using the hashtag ThinkDiff. Now over to Claire.
Hi, thanks, and welcome to our session on envisioning the future of open source seed. My name is Claire Luby. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Source Seed Initiative. I'm joined by Jack Kloppenberg here in Madison, Wisconsin. He is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Sociology Department. He's also co-founder of the Open Source Seed Initiative. We're also joined by Andrew Still out in the Willamette Valley in Oregon on the west coast of the US. He is a freelance plant breeder as well as owner of Adaptive Seeds. And we're really excited to be part of the Disruptive Innovation Festival today and discuss the central question of what if we could redesign everything in relation to seeds. So I'll give a brief introduction about the Open Source Seed Initiative and set the stage a little bit. I'll then turn it over to Jack to give a little bit more detailed history as well as how we currently operate. And then we'll talk to Andrew, with Andrew about how he integrates open source into his plant breeding as well as into his seed company. So seeds and the genetic diversity that they represent are the foundation of our agricultural system. These seeds are part natural resource and part human innovation. Almost all of the food we eat and the plant fibers that we wear have been continually selected for thousands of years by people for different characteristics, whether that be a crop that grows at an elevation of 10,000 feet or for a color that's visually appealing. These interactions between plants and people have been operating for thousands of years.
Sorry. I want to jump in on this one. I think there's something going on with your audio.
Okay.
I'm going to mute you quickly now. And could you unplug it and plug it in? So we just reset the audio and hopefully it will work and you won't sound like a robot anymore. Just let me know, thumbs up if you're ready to give it another try. Yes, okay. You are still muted, so if you can unmute yourself and give it another go.
Is this any better?
Yes, it is. Thanks a lot.
Sorry about that. Should I start? I'll start back with the seeds. So seeds and the genetic diversity that they represent are the foundation of our agricultural system. These seeds are part natural resource and part human innovation. Almost all of the food that we eat and the plant fibers that we wear have been continually selected for thousands of years by people for various characteristics, such as a crop that does well at an elevation of 10,000 feet or for a color that's visually appealing. These interactions between plants and people have been operating for thousands of years. However, over the past 40 to 50 years or so, we've seen a marked shift away from this idea of plants as the common heritage of humankind to a more legalistic idea that one can claim ownership over an entire plant's phenotype or genotype by making just a small modification through the course of selection. We're not even talking about genetic engineering, just simple recombination through controlling which plants pollinate each other and then selecting from their progeny for plants that contain the characteristics that we're looking for. There's also been dramatic consolidation of the seed industry over this period. Today, only a handful of companies control more than half of the world's commercial plant breeding and seed sales, and these companies continue to consolidate. This means that seeds, the common heritage of humankind and the basis of our agricultural system, are primarily being controlled by just a few decision makers. And these decision makers are increasingly using legal means to prevent seed saving, further plant breeding, and even research by others. So our question is, What gives anyone the right to claim so extensive a degree of ownership and control over crops that so many generations of humans have contributed to, when our hands have only touched them for a brief period of time? We are inspired to find an alternative to these increasingly restrictive legal arrangements. This inspiration came in part from the free and open source software movement that has provided alternatives to proprietary software. The idea behind open source was to create a protected commons. This means that anyone is free to use open source seeds for whatever purposes they choose, given that they also agree to allow anyone else those same freedoms to use that seed or its derivatives. The Open Source Seed Initiative works with plant breeders who have selected new varieties and want them to be released as open source. We also work with seed companies who sell open source varieties to farmers and gardeners. We use the open source pledge as the copyleft commitment to open source that passes from plant breeder to seed company to farmers and gardeners. This pledge reads, "You have the freedom to use these OSSI pledge seeds in any way you choose. In return, you pledge not to restrict others' use of these seeds or their derivatives by patents or other means, and to include this pledge with any transfer of these seeds or their derivatives." The Open Source Seed Initiative also maintains a database of open source varieties and works with our partners to build the open source seed movement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack, who's going to give us a little more history about how this whole initiative developed, as well as giving us some more information on what we're doing today.
Hey friends, how y'all doing out there? Glad to be talking at you. Thank you for joining us today. Claire's talked about some of the reasons that we got together, and there's some abstractions there, and I want to be a little more material here. This is what we're talking about, seeds. And we call these seeds, if you can read that, indentured seed. Why is that? That's because this is a corn variety, a maize variety, a maize hybrid variety, produced by one of those big companies that Claire was talking about. This seed here, we call it indentured because it's use restricted. There are actually 32 patents on this seed here. There are 20 from Monsanto, 12 from DuPont. And what a patent is a restriction on who may use something. You can only use it with the permission of the person that holds that patent. And what that means for the seed here is that, oh, by the way, farmers don't actually buy this seed. They now rent it. They rent a one-time use. So what the patent means for this seed here is that you can't save it. You can't replant it. You can't share it. You can't breed with it. You can't use it for anything except to grow a crop for sale. And that's legally where you are. This is why we call it indentured seed. It's seed that isn't free. So what we're trying to do is to design a new system. What we have done is design a new system opposed to the indentured seed system, the seed system of the gene giants, the seed system of a monocultural agriculture, a lack of diverse agriculture. And what we've got is an alternative. It's a new system that sits alongside this one. And we call it our freed seed system because we're freeing this seed. The seed in this jar here is free for use. You can save it. You can share it. You can breed with it. You can study it. You can sell it. You can do anything you want with this seed, except one thing. You can't restrict other people's use of this seed, if you distribute it, or of the progeny of this seed, whether you save it and replant it and sell it, or whether you breed with it, which is what we're really after. The breeding, the use information, to create the new varieties, the new combinations of genes that we need for the world to feed itself, for farmers to feed themselves, and to feed us in these very uneven circumstances that we find ourselves in, politically, economically, and especially environmentally. As the environment changes, we're going to need new sorts of varieties to respond to the changing parameters of diseases and temperatures and moisture regimes that are clearly coming as global warming emerges. That means we need an enormous amount of human ingenuity, plant breeding, to generate new varieties, new cultivars to respond to changing conditions. And that means that we need more breeders, and that we need to free the seed from the narrow range of breeders that are available in the corporate institutions, in the Monsantos and the Bayers and the Syngentas and the ChemChinas. That's why we're here. And what we're doing is encouraging breeders and seed companies to go with our pledge that Claire said. I'm going to read it to you again, because it probably went by you kind of fast. Here's the open source seed pledge. You have the freedom. That's what we're talking about. We call it freed, with a D on the end of it, seed, not free seed, freed for use. You have the freedom, says our pledge, to use these OSSI pledge seeds in any way you choose. That's freedom. In return, you have an obligation. In return, you pledge not to restrict others' use of these seeds or their derivatives. Of these seeds or their derivatives. So once you got these seeds and they're distributed, or you breed with them, the new cultivars, the new combinations are also OSSI pledged. It's an expanding pool of material. So it's open source, but it's a special kind of open source, what you might know as copyleft. Because once you distribute the seeds or the derivatives, and you can't use patents or other means, and you include this pledge with the distribution of these seeds or their progeny, it's viral. The pool of material expands, and it does a second thing. Claire mentioned protected commons. So Monsanto looks at this seed here from Carol Deppy, Cascade Ruby Gold, and says, oh, that's got some interesting characteristics. Let's grab a hold of some of that seed and breed it into some of our line so we can sell it. They can't do that. Because the open source pledge is like a license. If Monsanto takes some of that seed, breeds with it, their new variety gets pulled into the open source material, the open source pool, the open source protected commons. Protected commons, why? Because Monsanto wants no part of that. They're not interested in doing things that can't be privatized and use restricted. That's what we're all about. Trying to put together a community of people, an alternative, disruptive community composed of breeders like Andrew Steele, who you're going to hear from in a little while. Seed companies that buy into this community of practice based on freedom and sharing. And that's Andrew. He's going to tell you something about that too, because he's not only a seed breeder, he has a seed company and sells the seeds. We're talking about a new kind of seed as well, seed bred in organic systems for an agroecological system. And we're asking you to think about being part of that system as well, to be the consumers, the purchasers of these seeds. Now, Andrew's going to tell you right now about how he breeds them and how he sells them and who he sells them to. You're on, Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andrew from Adaptive Seeds. We have a small seed company in outside of Eugene, Oregon, and we breed a lot of varieties of seed, but mostly what we do is we try to sell seed to farmers and gardeners of really unique varieties that are mostly highly adapted to the Pacific Northwest ecosystem bioregion. Really, our whole purpose of starting the seed company was to bring biodiversity back to the food system a little bit more robustly, because we were inspired by organizations like the Seed Savers Exchange to, when we saw how much biodiversity in the food system was eroding, there was fewer and fewer varieties of open pollinated non-hybrid seed available on the market, and we saw that as a huge problem, because when we were starting as young farmers, we were really excited about unique varieties. So we saw it as kind of our goal is to bring biodiversity back to not only gardens, but also to farmers and to the food system. it's little known that most of the vegetables we eat are just a handful of hybrid varieties from a few companies. Even if it's from 50 different farms, most of them are planting much of the same seed. So it was our goal to bring real varieties back that perform well for gardeners and farmers, so we weren't so dependent on just a few little bits of genetics. When we were first starting as farmers, we decided to take our seasonal unemployment and go travel to Europe and to Asia to find unique varieties and to bring some of our own varieties and share them with people that we met along the way. Instead of just being a tourist, we decided to really learn about seed saving and meet other seed savers all over the world. And we found that there's a huge community of independent seed savers and seed companies that are also of the same philosophy of wanting to share seeds and to really find unique, interesting things just for the fun of it and because it's beautiful and interesting and tasty, but also because it can build a more resilient food system to have more diversity at play. We called that the Seed Ambassadors Project, and that was really where a lot of our original seed stocks came from, because we gave seed on our trips. We actually collected close to 1,000 varieties that weren't available in the US for commercial sale. So over the years, we kind of phased out our vegetable production and are working on other farms, and we started our own seed company, Adaptive Seeds, to help distribute those seeds. And along the way, we also started doing some plant breeding. So one of my favorite things to do is to spend time in the fields breeding plants and selecting varieties. But as a seed company having to pay the bills, it's not always easy to justify the time to go and breed varieties. So one of the things that the Open Source Seed Initiative helps us with is it really kind of encourages us to go out there and do some plant breeding and register or pledge it open source. And it builds more of that community for the future. I kind of see it from a business model standpoint that it differentiates us in the marketplace as being open source and really trying to be a good community player and share. But also I see it as an investment in the future, because the more open source seeds we get and have, the bigger the community is and the more resilient the open source food system becomes. It's almost like it's only right to give back when I've borrowed so much from other people. Even though I see myself as a plant breeder, I don't see myself as even the primary person involved in this variety that I've released, because it's been generations, if not thousands of years before me and I'm just adding a little bit of selection event to the end of the process, which makes me the steward of that variety, but it doesn't make me the owner of the variety. So this is primarily why we got involved in open source, is to be part of this community and build it for the future, because I feel like the patent system is just leading to more consolidation and monopoly, and hybrids and patents. It's just a form of domination in the marketplace to create more power amongst a few people. And in order to create more resilience and more beauty, generally speaking, I feel like we need to spread that power around and work together and share more. So that's why we got involved. And it's also really fun to be part of that community. I always like to make sure what I do is also fun and exciting. So that's pretty much it as far as why I got involved. And yeah, I guess we could move on to questions, I guess.
All right, yes, thanks a lot for that introduction and a very interesting topic. We already have some questions coming in, and for everybody watching, keep them coming. You can comment below the video on the session page or use Twitter. We have a question from Tex. And the question is, who owns seeds today? Is it really only a couple of companies?
No, it isn't only a couple of companies. Most seeds are owned by the people who hold them. Most seeds, and in fact, the huge proportion of the seeds available in the world today are actually in the global south, in places like Tanzania and Kenya and Nicaragua and Indonesia. What we're talking about ownership over seeds is over commercial varieties, the varieties that farmers in the industrialized North are using. The kinds of varieties like these that I would show, the endangered seeds. It's not so much that seeds themselves are owned. It's that patents and other intellectual property rights are taken out over the traits that are in those seeds. And once a commercial variety, which is sold widely, is patented or have other use restrictions on it, then farmers cannot save and replant. The companies that dominate the seed trade today are, in fact, about 60%, 66% of the seeds in commercial circulation, that is, that are being sold in packages and in bags like these, are controlled by 6 companies, which will soon be 3 companies. Monsanto and Bayer are, Bayer, a German company, is buying Monsanto. ChemChina is buying Syngenta, and Dow and DuPont have merged. Mostly those seeds are the seeds that are in important varieties like maize and soy. Those are the varieties that are GM, that are GMO, that are genetically engineered. That's why the companies want them. They're selling them to farmers who can pay for them or rent them. Nevertheless, there are many, many, many smallholders all over the world who continue to save and replant their own seeds and to do their own breeding. The problem, that we are seeing, is that the property regimes that are characteristic of the EU and of North America and Canada and Australia are being spread and imposed along with a whole range of other market regulations in TRIPS and in the World Trade Organization and in international arrangements, which are beginning to restrict now what farmers around the world who still have control over their own seeds are doing. That is a tremendous threat, especially in the global south, to people who are trying to feed themselves. It isn't a matter of whether a farmer in Iowa or France is going to be saving and replanting his or her own seed. It's a matter of whether farmers in Tanzania can save their own seeds, or whether they will be subject to the kind of use restrictions that the companies are imposing through law. That's the problem right now. And so it isn't so much that seeds are being owned as who is developing a new variety of seeds, because farmers in Tanzania, just like farmers in the United States, need new varieties. What's also accompanying the domination of a few companies in commercial seeds is the erosion of public breeding capacity of our universities and our government organizations and international organizations to produce the new varieties that farmers want and need. So there's a variety of problematic structural dynamics going on. So no, it isn't so much that farmers don't own seeds anymore, but that the capacity to breed and to use them is being undermined.
So we have a question coming in. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly mute you. We have a question coming in from Jennifer that actually taps into what you're saying right now pretty well. The question is, how optimistic are you about changing this system?
I can maybe answer a little bit. I am not very optimistic about the corporate structures changing because they have a lot of benefit from that system. And also, I'm not particularly optimistic about even universities and institutions changing very much, because they also have been privatizing most of what they've been breeding. Even though they claim to be public institutions, they privatize the majority of the material they release. But I am very optimistic in the so-called private independent breeders and small seed companies, because they usually release the majority of their material to the public domain, which is funny that we call those, they call us private and they call the universities public, when we actually release our material public and they release their material privately. But that's just a little silly to me. But I see so many of these new beginning and even established seed companies and plant breeders that are independent, doing it for the love of it. trying to time involved to do the breeding, but not necessarily trying to supply profit to shareholders in addition, that there's dozens and dozens of small companies and dozens of independent plant breeders doing really cool work in all different places, which is also important to me from my perspective, that we need as many people in different areas doing this work because it's a location-based process. You need to breed for the environment of intended use, and what better way to do it than to have lots of independent plant breeders all over helping with that process, and then sharing between regions and sharing ideas and material between each other. So I'm very optimistic on that level, even though I'm very pessimistic about reforming the big systems.
Do you, Jack and Claire, have anything to contribute to that?
Oh, I think Andrew nailed it. I mean, I am not very optimistic about the capacity of where we're going if we allow the large companies to continue on the path that they have us on. But our job is to disrupt. And what is cool is the emergence of people like Andrew and Claire. Claire's a plant breeder too, and the growth of OSSI over the last 2 years. You know, we now have more than 380 varieties of open source seed available. We have 38 plant breeders who have pledged varieties to OSSI, and we have 50 seed companies from which you can buy those seeds. And as Andrew said, you know, the breeders are out there. Look around and you find independent, freelance people doing it on their own because they enjoy it and love it. And that happens everywhere, by the way. That's happening in the EU. And of course, we have millions of farmer breeders in the global south, in places like Nicaragua, Tanzania. So I think that's the future. And the future, it's up to us to support those alternatives that, you know, are the future that wants to be.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So coming from you saying that like it's not only in the US, it's everywhere around the world. And Andrew said that like sharing of the seeds is one of the most important things. So my question would be there, like how do plant seeders communicate, and how do they share the seeds with each other?
In my experience, it's been very much just trying to find someone that is kind of on your level of sharing, and that typically just means when you're in a group of people that are gardeners or seed savers, or you're in another country traveling, or wherever you are, just starting to share seeds. And I've had the experience of like bringing seeds out and saying, here, I brought all this stuff for you. It's a gift. I really would like you to try it if you can find it useful. And many times people just get up and leave and run off and then come back 10 minutes later with their seeds saying, I didn't know it was a seed swap. This is really fun. It's really great. And it's just naturally happens time and time again. But also there's ways of connecting on the internet, through web forums, on Facebook, on like different events, different seed swaps, locally seed swaps, and different conferences. And it's really interesting because everywhere I've traveled, it's always been a similar language that we all have shared. It's kind of the plant nerd language, and we're all kind of part of that same family no matter where I've been. It's always been very open and very sharing and very communicative. It just happens naturally. It's why we probably have so much biodiversity in the first place. For thousands of years, it's even been the same situation. It's human nature in a way, at least when you're not trying to control everything for other purposes.
All right, so we have another question coming in from Harry. The question is, would it be better for farmers in countries where a lot of food is grown, Kenya and Tanzania, that the countries own IP of the seeds?
They couldn't do that now. In fact, the laws that are coming in the global south, reflecting the same kind of laws that have been extended in the US and in the EU, permit farmers to actually take out IP on their seeds should they wish to, or should they have the capacity to. But there are certain restrictions. To be able to nail down a variety as mine, you have to do something. It has to be distinct, different from others, uniform, i.e. you plant it and it comes up the same way, and stable. That's not what most farmers' varieties are. In contrast to the very genetically narrow varieties of the companies that are in commercial circulation, farmer seeds are genetically diverse. That's what makes them resilient. That's what makes them agroecological. So they don't qualify for the kinds of requirements that it would take to register a seed. Moreover, how much money have you got to register a seed? If you're a farmer, have you got the resources to do that? And few farmers in communities in the South can. And why wouldn't they register the seeds? And why do they want intellectual? Why do they want to exclude others from use? As Andrew had just been describing, the tradition over thousands of years and what continues today in places like Tanzania and Kenya and Nicaragua and Indonesia and the Philippines is to share the seeds. Precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to recover with the open source seed initiative. You're in a community. You're sharing within your community. It's to your advantage to allow other people to use your seed because you can use their seed and exchange with it. And you get this dynamism of planting and selection that maintains varieties, as Andrew says, in a place, locally adapted, controlled by the people who need it and want it, and who feel themselves part of a sharing community. So there's no need for smallholder farmers we would argue in the US as well, to own their seed, to not own their seed, to take out intellectual property rights on their seed. It's not something that is useful or worth it to them.
And so a question elaborated on that from Maria. What makes a seed distinct enough to be different?
Go for it.
This has been you want to go for it, Andrew? So this question of what makes a seed actually distinct enough to be different is an age-old question in, I think, in plant breeding, and especially since people began to, and governments began to legislate on intellectual property rights over plants. So back in the 1930s, with the first sort of introduction of these conversations into U.S. law, this idea of what is a derivative, what is distinct enough to be different, has been a question, and I think that's still being argued to some extent. Andrew, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, that is a deceptively complicated question, and it could lead down quite the rabbit hole, because really, when it comes down to it, what something is different is what you think is different. And sometimes that means you can see a difference between varieties, sometimes that you have reason to believe that they're genetically different even though they look the same, because things that look the same might be different technically. They might have different histories, like let's say there's dozens of varieties of garlic that are clones of each other. They're actually genetically identical, but they have been in a community for hundreds of years, so those communities think of them as their own variety. And because they've been in that area, they may have some phenotypic changes that are more epigenetic, or because of the ground that they were grown in, they look different, even though they're not genetically different. But they're different varieties in a sense. So it gets really complicated. And then like what I end up doing a lot of work with is diverse gene pools. Claire's bred a few diverse gene pools where you take several varieties and mix them together and let them cross-pollinate with each other. And they might have a theme, like they might all be Chantenay carrot types, but it's such a unique pool of different diversity that it'd be hard to even call it a variety. So it leads down this track of understanding the natural environment a little bit more, and it can be a long conversation, and people still debate it every time. But I just wanted to say that pedigree and lineage is not necessarily the only thing that can make something different.
what the companies want, of course, is that they can, and this is where they can appropriate a nice variety. Say some farmer has found some traits in his or her rice that allows it to grow in dry conditions, or is cold tolerant or something like that. They can appropriate that variety. They can make a few changes in it, which is to say change a couple of genes or gene sequences, and that becomes distinct. And because they have changed it, it's innovation. They can patent that variety, appropriate it, take it out of the public domain, take it out of the farmers' fields, make a small change, and call it theirs. That's one of the elements of what you might call biopiracy, and one of the things that farmers in the global south are objecting to, which is to say that the diversity that is generated all the time and has been over the millennia by farmers, by peasant farmers all over the world, is the raw material out of which the companies select for varieties that are distinct, uniform, stable, make a genetic change in them and call it theirs.
All right, well, thanks for answering that difficult question. I think it's time for our last question. And that question is, what could be an incentive for big businesses? So you've said that there will be 3 big businesses that do have patented seeds. What could be an incentive for them to go turn down from the patented seeds and go towards an open source seed?
There are none for the big 3, big 6, now soon to be the big 3. This is the way, the patents have little to do with innovation. Patents are supposed to encourage innovation. They're actually all about market control now. There are a whole set of mid-range seed companies, especially in vegetables, who are looking for some way to get out from under the domination of those big 3, big 6. They've actually contacted us and said, would open source be a way for us to move away from patents at least? And we have to say to them, probably not for you right now. There really is very little incentive for companies to move to that kind of, to an open source approach, largely because there's only a few of them now. And what they're doing is making deals with each other to manage their intellectual property rights so they aren't suing each other all the time. And what we're seeing is collusion and an increasing reinforcement of their power and their cooperation versus all the rest of us out there. So for the big companies right now, there's no incentive to go this route. It's up to those of us who are at the margins, people like Andrew and consumers and gardeners who can buy open source seed to do what we can to move things in a different direction and to disrupt.
I think that it might take a long time for things, because we're kind of in the beginning of this process of formalizing what it means to be public domain and open source. People have been breeding open source and public domain for forever, and even talking about it publicly in the plant breeding world recently for quite a while even. But this new organization and process is kind of nascent. And just like the fact of like most web servers running open source software, and even Microsoft flirting with the ideas of open source software, it took a long time to get there. Especially, I don't know, it took Microsoft, what, 30 years to start even thinking about it after saying that it was going to destroy the whole industry. So it might take a while for the small, more grassroots style to become more of a force, but I think it might take off quite quickly. We'll see.
All right, and so Jack, you just mentioned that the focus for now for the open source seed is more on the margins and the smaller companies. So how do we know if we're gonna use some seeds that they are open source? Is there some way that we can know?
to our website?
Yeah, so currently we have a database on our website, which is www.ossseeds.org, ossseeds.org. We have a database there, and that lists all of the open source varieties that are currently pledged and where that seed is available. And so you can find them there. You can also find them in the catalogs of one of our 50 partner seed companies, or sometimes directly from the plant breeder themselves if they're not a commercially available variety. So that is a place to know. They should be labeled with the open source logo and pledge. Oh.
There's the logo.
Yep. So that is another way to recognize that there's open source seed, and so that is another part of this is creating awareness about what does it mean for a variety to be open source, and how do we know that.
And by the way, open source seeds, OSSI Pledge, are available around the world. Actually, they're available in UK. They're available in Ireland and in UK. At the Real Seed Company in UK and in Brown Envelope Seeds in Ireland. We also have partners, breeders in Canada. We have partner breeders in Australia. And we have sister organizations around the world. It isn't only the Open Source Seed Initiative that is attempting to free seeds. There is in Germany a sister organization organized by the NGO Agricol. They now have 2 varieties of open source seed available. And we are working with the Center for Sustainable Agriculture in India, which has open source seeds available. And we are developing some opportunities in East Africa now.
All right, great to hear all about that. And it's very interesting also to see that it is a global movement, and what you've said earlier, that the global source of it, that people also talk into the same language. I think that's very interesting, and I'm really curious what the future of the open source seeds is going to be, as this is, I think, only the start of it. Thanks a lot for your session, for your talk. It was really inspiring. For everybody viewing, thanks a lot for viewing. We are at week 2 of the Disruptive Innovation Festival, and we have still loads of sessions going on. We have on our website playlists that have sessions categorized on themes, which could be an easy way for you to get your way around all the sessions that we have going on. So go to www.thinkdiff.co, where you can also watch sessions back. Thanks a lot for watching. For one last question for Claire, Jack, and Andrew, are you still gonna open up for answering some questions that will be in on the website online later on?
Sure, we'd be happy to.
Yes, thumbs up. Okay, thanks a lot, and that's bye for now.